Have you ever wondered how close hope comes to disappearing before it chooses to stay alive? Well, listen closely, because this story begins with a child standing at the edge of a stranger's barn, bargaining with the last strength in his small body. He wasn't asking for mercy, but for work. Why? Because his mother was lying on the ground, collapsing behind him, just 1 mile away from never getting up again. This is the story of John, and it takes place in the heart of the Great Depression. Picture it, Dust Bowl America, where the land itself seemed to be giving up. John was just 9 years old. His family had lost their farm in Oklahoma. They had packed what little they had into a worn-out truck and headed west, chasing the promise of a better life in California. But the road was cruel. Their truck broke down, their food ran out, and sickness took hold of his mother, Sarah. One scorching afternoon, Sarah couldn't walk another step. She sank to the dusty ground, her breath shallow, her eyes clouded with fever. John's father, a man whose spirit had been worn down to a nub, sat beside her, his head in his hands, defeated. But John, he couldn't accept defeat. He looked at his mother's pale face, and a fire ignited in his small chest. He told his father he was going for help. He started walking, his small legs pumping, his eyes scanning the desolate horizon. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A barn. It was weathered and gray, but it was a sign of life. A man was out front, mending a fence. He was lean and tough, his face etched with the same hardships that had chased John's family across the country. John's heart pounded. This was his one chance. He walked right up to the farmer, his voice trembling but determined. "Sir," he said, trying to stand as tall as he could, "I'm looking for work. I can muck stalls, I can carry water, I can do anything you need." The farmer, whose name was Mr. Abernathy, looked down at this small, dusty boy. He was about to shoo him away. He had his own family to feed, his own worries. He didn't have time for another mouth, another problem. But then, he looked into John's eyes. He didn't see a beggar. He saw a fighter. He saw a desperation so profound it was almost tangible. "Work?" Abernathy grunted. "What's a little fella like you know about work?" "I know my mother is sick," John said, his voice cracking. "She's a mile back down that road. If she doesn't get help, she's going to leave us. I'll work for food. I'll work for medicine. Please, sir." Something in Abernathy's hardened exterior softened. Maybe he saw his own son in John's face. Maybe he remembered a time when he too had been at the mercy of a cruel world. He sighed, a long, heavy sound. "Where is she?" he asked. John pointed back the way he came. Without another word, Abernathy put down his tools, went into his house, and came back with his wife, a jar of water, and a small pouch of herbs. He hitched his old horse to a small wagon. "Get in, son," he said. They rode back down the road. The journey felt agonizingly slow. Every bump, every turn, made John's stomach clench. What if they were too late? What if his courage hadn't been enough? When they arrived, Sarah was barely conscious. Mr. Abernathy's wife, a kind woman with gentle hands, immediately went to her side. She cooled Sarah's forehead with a damp cloth and coaxed a few sips of water mixed with the medicinal herbs between her lips. Mr. Abernathy and John's father carefully lifted Sarah into the back of the wagon. They brought the family back to their small farmhouse. For 3 days, John and his father watched and waited as Mrs. Abernathy nursed Sarah back from the brink. John kept his promise. From sunup to sundown he worked. He fed the chickens, slopped the hogs, and hauled buckets of water until his arms ached and his hands were raw. He never complained. Every task he completed was a prayer for his mother's recovery. On the 4th morning, John walked into the small room where his mother was resting. Her eyes were open. And for the first time in weeks, they were clear. She saw him standing in the doorway, covered in dirt and sweat, and a weak smile touched her lips. "My brave boy," she whispered. At that moment, all the exhaustion, all the fear, washed away from John. Hope, which had been a tiny, flickering ember, roared back into a brilliant flame. The Abernathys let John's family stay. John's father, his spirit renewed, found work alongside Mr. Abernathy on the farm. They didn't have much, but they had a roof over their heads, food on their table, and something far more valuable: community. They had found kindness in the middle of nowhere. Years passed. John grew into a strong young man, his character forged in the fires of that desperate time. He never forgot the lesson he learned at 9 years old, that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in your muscles, but in your will to keep going. It's the courage to take that one extra step, to ask for help, to bargain for a chance not just for yourself but for the people you love. This story isn't just about the Great Depression. It's a timeless reminder that even when everything seems lost, a single act of courage can change everything. It's about how hope doesn't just appear, it's something you have to fight for. It's the choice to stand up when the world wants to knock you down, and to look a stranger in the eye and ask for a chance to work, a chance to live. The next time you feel like you're at your breaking point, think of that 9-year-old boy. Think of him walking that lonely mile, fueled by nothing but love for his mother. His story teaches us that hope isn't a passive thing we wait for. It's an active, powerful force that we create. It's the decision to keep moving forward, even when the path is uncertain. What does this story spark in you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where one person's determination completely turned the tide? Share your thoughts in the comments below. He'd gone over the words 100 times in his head, but when the barn door finally creaked open, his voice still trembled. He stood barefoot on frozen dirt, his toes numb, his shirt far too thin for the wind that cut across the fields like a blade. His small hands were cracked and red, shaking not just from fear, but from a gnawing hunger that had lived inside him for days. "If I sweep your barn," he said, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat, "would you let us sleep there, sir?" "Mama's too weak to walk another mile." The man inside the barn didn't answer right away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years of sun and silence. His name was Thomas Hare, a farmer who had learned long ago that kindness could be costly, and trust even more so. He had buried his wife beneath a quiet oak tree 10 winters earlier and had kept his heart locked up tight ever since. To him, strangers were trouble, and trouble was something he could no longer afford. Yet something in the boy's eyes held him there. It wasn't just desperation, it was a heavy, unwavering sense of responsibility. "Where is your mother?" Thomas finally asked, his voice rough. The boy turned and pointed a shaky finger toward the road. "Down there. She tried to keep walking, sir. She said she was fine, but she fell. I told her I'd find help." Thomas followed the boy's gesture and saw her just barely collapse near a fence post, wrapped in a worn shawl, completely still. The wind tugged at her hair, and she looked less like someone resting and more like someone fading away. A heavy sigh escaped Thomas's lips, weighed down by old memories. "You shouldn't be asking strangers for help," he said gruffly. The boy nodded, his eyes fixed on the man. "I know, but I don't have anyone else." That answer hit harder than Thomas expected. Without another word, he grabbed his heavy coat from a peg and walked past the boy. They hurried together toward the road. When they reached the woman, her skin was cold to the touch, her lips pale, her breathing faint and shallow. When Thomas lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, as if life itself was loosening its grip. He brought them into the barn, not the house, not yet. The barn was warm enough, filled with the scent of hay, animals, and honest work. Thomas laid her down gently on a pile of fresh straw. The boy, whose name he would later learn was Eli, immediately knelt beside her. He took her hand, whispering that they were safe now, though he couldn't have been sure it was true. Thomas watched from a distance, a silent observer. That night, he brought them water, then a bowl of hot soup. He told himself it was only temporary, just until morning, just until she could walk again. But morning came with a high fever, and a deep, rattling cough, and a new wave of fear that settled over the quiet barn. The woman woke briefly, her eyes unfocused and clouded. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "I'm here, Mama," the boy said quickly, his voice urgent and full of love. "I did good. I found a place." She tried to smile, but she couldn't manage it. Instead, tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I tried." Thomas turned away, his own heart aching. Her words echoed too closely to his own past, to losses he tried so hard to bury. The days began to blur together. Without ever being asked, Eli swept the barn floor clean. He cleaned out stalls, hauled buckets of water, and fixed broken sections of fence with hands that were far too small for the heavy tools. He didn't work like a child. He worked like someone who understood that survival was a full-time job, a debt to be paid every single day. Every night, he sat faithfully beside his mother, wiping her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. He told her stories, wild, hopeful stories about all the places they would go and all the things they would see when she was better. She listened when she could. And when she drifted into feverish sleep, he talked anyway, filling the silence with his determined hope. Thomas watched it all. He noticed how Eli never complained, how he always said, "Thank you," for even the smallest kindness. He saw how the boy would stand a little straighter every time Thomas walked by, as if he was afraid that any moment of stillness might get them sent away, back out into the cold. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas brought a blanket from the house. It wasn't for the barn. He stood at the door for a long moment, wrestling with himself, with the walls he had built around his heart. "You can move her inside," he said finally, his voice still gruff but lacking its earlier edge. "It's warmer in the house." Eli's eyes, so often filled with worry, widened in disbelief. "Really, sir?" Thomas just nodded. "Just until she recovers," he added, more for his own benefit than for the boy's. But deep down, he knew something had already changed. Because barns are for animals, and homes are for people. And whether Thomas wanted to admit it or not, these two strangers had begun to feel like something he had lost a long, long time ago. Something he never thought would find him again. That night, as the wind howled outside the farmhouse, the boy slept in a real bed for the first time in what felt like forever. He slept without fear, wrapped in warmth and a fragile sense of safety. He was unaware that the hardest days were still ahead, and that this farm was only the beginning of a journey that would test every heart involved, and reveal just how far love can rise from the depths of desperation. The house felt strange to Eli, at first too quiet, too clean, too permanent. He slept on the very edge of the bed, afraid to even wrinkle the crisp sheets. Each hour, he would wake with a jolt, his small body tense just to check if his mother was still breathing beside him. The gentle rise and fall of her chest felt like a small miracle, one he believed he had to earn by staying awake, by keeping watch. He was a silent, vigilant guardian in the dark. Thomas, the owner of the house, noticed everything. He saw the way Eli flinched at sudden noises, the way he would ask permission for the simplest things, even for a glass of water. He saw how gratitude poured out of the boy in soft, careful words, as if he feared the supply might run out if he used them too freely. It was a gratitude born from desperation, and it was heartbreaking to witness. The fever, however, was relentless. It didn't break quickly. Some nights, the weight of it all became too much for Eli. He would sit by his mother's bedside, crying silently into the worn sleeve of his shirt. He blamed himself. If only he had been stronger, faster, older. He replayed every mile they had walked, every wrong turn they had made, every place they hadn't stopped sooner. He was just a boy, but he carried the burdens of a man. Through the thin walls of the old farmhouse, Thomas heard those quiet, choked sobs. He heard the boy's despair. One night, sleep was impossible for Thomas. He found himself at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of cold, forgotten coffee. In the stillness, memories he'd long tried to suppress came flooding back uninvited. He saw his wife, her face pale in the dim light, heard her coughing in the dark. He remembered the agonizing, helpless waiting, the crushing realization that sometimes love alone is not enough to keep death away. The pain was as fresh as if it were yesterday. Suddenly he stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked with purpose to the bedroom where Eli kept his vigil. "She needs a doctor," he said, his voice firm. "I'll call one tomorrow." Eli looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. "We can't pay," he started, his voice a whisper. Thomas raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "I didn't ask about money." The boy just nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of relief and disbelief. In that moment, a seed of trust began to bloom in his guarded heart, despite his best efforts to keep it locked away. The doctor came. Medicine followed. Then came rest, warmth, and the slow healing passage of time. Gradually, the woman, her name was Sarah, began to return from the brink. The color returned to her cheeks. Her voice, once a fragile whisper, grew stronger each day. And then the day came when she sat up in bed on her own. Eli let out a laugh, a sound so bright and pure it seemed to startle even himself. It was the first time he had laughed in weeks. "I knew it," he said, gripping her hands tightly. "I told you we'd be okay." Sarah's gaze drifted around the unfamiliar room, confusion slowly giving way to understanding. When her eyes landed on Thomas standing quietly in the doorway, they filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay." Thomas simply shook his head. "Just get better," he said softly. That was all the payment he needed. The days melted into weeks. The small house settled into a new rhythm. Eli continued to work, but now Thomas insisted on paying him for his help. More than that, he began to teach him. He taught him how to fix tools properly, how to mend a broken fence. He taught him how to read the sky for signs of changing weather, and how to listen to the quiet language of the land. Eli absorbed it all, his mind as hungry as his stomach had once been. He wasn't just hungry for food anymore. He was hungry for knowledge, for purpose, for a sense of belonging. One crisp evening, as they were mending a fence together, the last rays of sunlight painting the fields in gold, Eli asked a question softly. "Did you have kids, sir?" Thomas paused, his hand stilling on the fence wire. A shadow passed over his face. "No," he replied, his voice quiet. "Oh," Eli hesitated, sensing he touched on something painful. Then he added, "If you did, I think they'd be lucky." The simple, heartfelt words struck Thomas deeper than the boy could ever know. That night, Thomas found himself standing beneath the sprawling oak tree where his wife was buried. For the first time in years, he spoke to her aloud, his voice raspy from disuse. "I didn't plan this," he said to the silent air. "But they need me, and I think I need them too." A sense of peace, one he hadn't felt in a long, long time, settled over him. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the world in a thick layer of snow. The drifts piled high, and soon the roads were closed. Leaving became impossible. Sarah recovered fully, her laughter and warmth filling the once silent corners of the house. She and Thomas started talking more, sharing their stories of loss and grief, finding a common language that only the wounded can truly understand. No grand promises were made. None were needed. Their shared space was enough. One morning, Eli stood at the window, watching the endless dance of falling snowflakes. He turned to his mother, his voice steady but careful, holding a universe of hope. "Mama," he said, "do we still have to leave when the roads open?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Thomas. The man cleared his throat, a flicker of emotion in his eyes. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "If you don't want to," Eli turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You mean we can stay?" Thomas nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "If you'll have me." In an instant, the boy crossed the room and threw his arms around Thomas, hugging him with a fierce, certain strength. Thomas froze for a second, caught off guard by the sudden affection. Then, slowly, he wrapped his own arms around the boy, his heart breaking open in a way that both hurt and healed all at once. Years later, when Eli was a man, he would tell the story of the night he asked a stranger for a place to sleep. He would say it wasn't the barn or the shelter that saved them. It was the moment someone chose compassion over caution, connection over loneliness, love over fear. And he would always remember that hope doesn't always arrive with a loud announcement or a grand gesture. Sometimes it comes quietly, on a desperate night, in the form of a boy with a broom, a mother too weak to walk, and a man who finally found the courage to open his door. And his heart. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that explores the power of human kindness. We'll see you next time.